Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Trauma-Informed and Responsive Legal Representation, a CLE that is co-sponsored by Root and Rebound. Root and Rebound is a reentry advocacy organization. Its mission is to restore power and resources to the families and communities most harmed by mass incarceration through legal advocacy, public education, policy reform, and litigation. Our presenters this afternoon are Rebecca Berry, Hotline and Direct Services Attorney and incoming Head of People at Root and Rebound. And we also have Dejan Watts, Root and Rebound's Women's Support and Social Services Manager for Central Valley, California. And so Grayson already went over, you need to be on a computer, not your cell phones. When you see the attendance tracker come up, just click yes to show that you are in attendance. And I've also placed Root and Rebound's website address in the chat if you want to learn more about the organization. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dejan and Rebecca. And thank you so much for being here. It is early on the West Coast, so we thank you for taking the time to be with us this afternoon.
Thank you, Alicia. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Just to share a little bit more about ourselves before we get into this, we like to share kind of why, for me as an attorney, why am I doing this work and why am I basically so dedicated to making sure our services are trauma informed. And a lot of that is connected with my own healing journey. I went through law school and all the stress of that and getting, taking the bar, passing it. And after that felt so depleted, really felt like I had no energy for the work that I wanted to do. And after getting some support, recognized and was diagnosed with complex PTSD. So I had been walking around not even knowing how my own trauma was impacting me. And then let alone, the work that I was doing. My past work is all connected to survivors of sexual violence, survivors of other types of violence coming out of our systems. And so with that, I had to deal with my own trauma while also supporting clients who were going through trauma as well. And so with learning about that experience for myself and learning tools to ground myself and get me into a place that was centered, it felt very important to share this with other attorneys, share this with other folks in the field, especially because this is not a part of a typical legal education. And so this is very much close to my heart and tied into why I do this work. And so I wanted to share that. And Dejan, you can also share some about your background.
Yes, thank you. Good morning over here, but good afternoon over there. So, this work is really important to me, not only because I am also system impacted, so I've been to prison, I've also been in jail, but also the trauma that I experienced before then. The trauma as a child and the way that I grew up and the things that were normalized to me, there's a lot of unlearning that had to happen, especially because I am a mother as well. And so the way that I teach my children and guide them and speak into them looks very different than the way that I grew up. And that is only because of therapy, of healing spaces, of other women who have spoken into me and surrounded me with care, joy, and just love. And so in going through my own journey and the clients that we do serve, which if not 95% of them, all of them have experienced severe trauma. In our intake, we kind of go into detail on what that looks like. And it's just really important for us that we not only address it, but we also, educate them on what the trauma is, what their triggers are. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But that we also, bring together tools and resources and solutions for what it is that we've all been through. And so I work out of our Central Valley office, and in our office, we do give more of a intense direct services. We help with economic security, also anything that falls under social services. All of our clients are connected to therapy, and they also come to groups that we facilitate weekly that kind of speak to those areas within them that, you know, need healing. So yeah, that's me. Hello.
Thank you, Dejan. So I feel like we're a good team. We balance each other out and have very unique but complementary, I think, perspectives that make this training very interesting. So let's get into it. First, we would love to do a quick check-in. We can see the chat, so you are welcome to put a number in the chat of which meme you are today. Again, it is early, it is 9:30 for us, so I'm a bit of a 4 and a 5 today, but feeling good. So if you all could just, yeah, give us an idea of how you're feeling this afternoon, and we can head forward. Lots of 4s, I get it. Yay, like the 6.
All right, so while we are checking in with ourselves, I'll kind of just go over our agenda for today. So we'll talk about grounding and what grounding is, and also give some examples. We'll talk about the ACE study and assessment. We'll talk about brain ITR and the psychoeducation, part mapping, hurt self versus true self, and best practices through R&R case studies.
Thank you for all those 4s. We all hanging in there.
Okay, so objectives and goals. Today, we are going to learn about the widespread impact of trauma, be able to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma responses in our clients, our family, staff, others involved with trauma, and also ourselves. We'll learn grounding tools and share some language about instinctual trauma responses that can be used in practice. We'll learn best practices around being a trauma-informed and responsive advocate, and we'll just learn more about ourselves as a whole. So this trauma is for everyone. We are all impacted by trauma, and it does affect how we interact with others. We'll go into it a little bit later about what different traumas we can experience, but they don't all look super severe on the outside. Sometimes they look like, you know, you were bullied. Sometimes they look like a divorce. Sometimes they look like someone you love with every part of you, they betrayed you. It looks different, but we've all experienced it at one time or another.
Yeah, and trauma is also pretty pervasive in all of the systems that our clients and even ourselves are touching base with. And there's not always a culture in those different agencies and practices that are trauma informed. And so unfortunately, there's also a risk of re-traumatization when our clients and when we ourselves are accessing these services. And so as legal service providers, we can be the change and really shift that culture by being trauma informed with our legal services. And when we're trauma informed and responsive, the organizations and law firms and places of work that we're at become safer. Advocates and those receiving those services, they feel safer. Our jobs become a heck of a lot easier, especially working with heavy populations that are dealing with very severe trauma. And then our programming, any outreach, things that we're doing where we want to be working very much in the community becomes a lot more effective when we're trauma informed.
Okay, so let's talk about grounding. What is grounding? Let's say you are feeling spaced out or offline. That probably means that you're not grounded. So grounding means simple things that you can do to get back online or into the present moment, especially in the moment when you or someone else is being triggered. And again, we'll talk about triggers in a bit. Here are some examples of grounding. Becca and I actually use these quite often throughout our day. So here are just a few examples. Some things work better for others, maybe changing position if you're sitting or standing, or if you want to get your energy going by jumping and just kind of getting back to the moment. It could be you touching something near you. It could be a smell. It could be a taste. It could be a sound. It could be, something that you see in the room.
And so one example of a grounding exercise that we do with clients and we do with each other to make sure that we're online even before a training or even before a meeting, this is one example that stimulates all of your senses and really gets you back into the present. One of the most common symptoms of trauma is what's called dissociation. So basically your body's here, but your consciousness, like basically your sense of self is elsewhere. It might be in the past, it might be in the future. And so in order to get back to our center, back in the present, which is necessary when you're in a trauma response, different grounding exercises are super important. So I'm gonna model with Dejan what I would do with a client or with someone who's in a trauma response to get them grounded and back into the present. So I would go, hi, Dejan. Is it okay if we do a grounding exercise? You seem a little bit offline. I want to get you back in the present. Is that okay?
Yes, that's okay.
Okay. So let's just breathe together for a little bit. Let's do 2 deep breaths. So we'll get comfortable in your chair. You can have your eyes open or closed, up to you. But yeah, let's take a few deep breaths. So we'll start with the in breath. So let's breathe in. Hold it. And then let's breathe out. Let's do that one more time. So breathe in. And breathe out. Okay. And then I'm going to have you tell me 5 things you can see in the room.
Calendar, picture, plant, pin, phone.
Okay. And 4 things that you can touch.
Desk, water, paper, jacket.
Okay. What about 3 things that you can hear?
Traffic, a bird, someone talking.
And 2 things you can smell or like to smell?
My coffee, roses.
And 1 thing you can taste or you like to taste?
I can still taste my coffee.
Awesome. How are you feeling?
I feel good. I feel present.
Awesome. Let's get to work. So that's one example of that grounding exercise. Another grounding exercise that takes a little bit of artistic ability, but not a lot, which is why I used my picture, is called Safe Place, where basically this gets you grounded by putting yourself in a place that's safe for you. Safety is a big thing for people who have experienced trauma, for us who have experienced trauma, because at times the trauma of the situation is that you felt helpless, that you felt like your situation was not safe. And so getting in a mindset where you have a place that's secure and visualizing that either through your drawing or in your mind is a great way to get grounded as well. And so one of the most important parts of drawing a safe place and keeping that near you is to put just to put yourself in the picture, make sure your whole body is in it, and also that there's a pleasant and happy expression on your face. We'll talk a little bit about this later with like the actual brain science that's connected to this, but actually seeing the colors, putting yourself in that safe place, even seeing the expression stimulates your right brain and really does get you into a calming, grounded place. So this was my example. I did this when we were getting trained on this, and it's literally just me at an empty beach with my cheese plate and my journal and a happy, calm expression on my face as my safe place. And so whenever I'm feeling ungrounded, I can look back at that picture. I actually have one that's not digital that I've drawn and actually took the time to get some colors and put together. And that stays in my office, that stays on the wall. So again, if I'm feeling ungrounded or something's triggering a trauma response, I can look back at that picture. So yeah, safe place is another example. and grounding tool to do with any client, any age. It very much works. So yeah. Okay, so now that we have grounded, and that's another thing, like whenever we're going into a heavy issue or even going into a situation where trauma responses might be triggered, it's really important to ground first and ground out. So that's what we'll be doing today to model. So now that we've grounded, I can go into definitions. So what is trauma? Trauma is a response to violence or other kinds of stressful, overwhelming events. It can also be described as like a shock to our nervous system. It's a natural response to something that is traumatic. It's defined by mental health practitioners as exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violation. One important piece of this is that it is relative. So it depends on our own biological makeup, our own bodies, like depends on our own reaction. So something that was traumatizing to me with a more sensitive nervous system may not have been for someone else. But it is a normal reaction to abnormal or extreme situations that overwhelms our means of coping. And a lot of our clients, actually the majority of our clients have experienced being incarcerated, which based on this definition, absolutely is a trauma. Other types of trauma, there's acute types of trauma. So these are single incidents. I use a car accident as an example. It's a moment in time that you can really pinpoint as an acute trauma or any kind of accidents in that way. There's also chronic trauma. So these are repeated and prolonged. The thing that makes them so traumatic is the uncertainty of when it will end. And so folks who are in abusive relationships, again, being incarcerated, not knowing when you're going to be released, and even COVID-19, our lockdowns and quarantines at the very beginning was a huge trauma, collective trauma, in that we were, chronically in this uncertain place of when will we, be outside of this. And then there's complex trauma, which is more nebulous in that it's exposure to varied and multiple traumatic events. It's really hard to kind of pinpoint where the trauma is because it's coming at all sides. It's been described as kind of living in a soup of trauma. So for me, the best example would be growing up in like a dysfunctional family where, there's a lot of underlying tension that isn't resolved. And it may just seem normal that no one talks at dinner, or, it might just seem normal that, there's a blow up by one parent and then everyone kind of does their own thing. So just that like complex feeling, that would be an example of a complex trauma. Then there's also inter and multi-generational trauma. So we have our own personal traumas, and then we also are carrying, unfortunately, historical and cultural traumas that are attached to our group identity. And so this could be, if you are of Indigenous or Aboriginal lineage, you could be carrying some of that multi-generational trauma from their displacement. Folks who are descendants of people who were enslaved here, you can be carrying that trauma, genocides, massacres, any forced internment, anything where it was a group trauma, group experience where folks, nervous systems were deeply impacted. That does follow the lineage, it follows the family. And so due to the growing field of what's called epigenetics, we know, unfortunately, that this trauma can be passed down even in our very DNA. And so there's one study around descendants and survivors of the Holocaust, and what they found in the study is that folks who had family members and ancestors who were impacted by that event had higher stress hormones, even as folks were more, even though we were like a few generations out from the actual event. And one of those reasons could be how biologically tied we are to our ancestors. So these examples really stood out to me as a way to kind of visualize that. So it says the egg that created you developed inside of your mother when your grandmother was 5 months pregnant with her. So for a few months, 3 generations are sharing the same biological environment. So thinking about, what your mother went through, what traumas were attached to her life and her story, and then even what your grandmother is going through, all of those things are carried down the family line. Then when you think about your father's side, so while the egg carries the history of your grandmother's trauma, the sperm reflects the more recent life experiences of your father. So whatever they're going through is also impacting the next generation. So I have, 3 generations of, poverty and Jim Crow and issues on my mom's side. And then I have my father's side where there's addiction and other forms of mental health issues where, that trauma is being transferred. So yay, let's deal with it. Let's process all that's coming through. It's very, it's deep. It goes very deep. So these are just some examples of traumatic events. This is definitely not all inclusive. And again, it's very relative. So things that may seem small or seem insignificant to others can absolutely be traumatic events for ourselves. So let's talk about the ACE study. So this ACE study, the reason we go through this is because it's foundational to trauma-informed care. It was a study done by Kaiser, which basically surveyed their members. Kaiser is a healthcare organization that in the 90s decided they wanted to see if there was a direct connection between childhood experiences of trauma and adult healthcare outcomes or health well-being outcomes. And what they found through a study that had 10 questions of their 17,000 members was that yes, there actually is a direct correlation between how much trauma you experienced as a child and your health and wellness outcomes as an adult. And so the questions cover a range of experiences of what happened before a person turned 18. And really covers some very common traumatic events. And so this study is used as an assessment. It's a good way, it's not perfect by any means, but it is a good way to get a sense of where a person is at and how much trauma has impacted them. What it doesn't cover is like resiliency, as well as any interventions that might have happened during your childhood to better your outcomes as an adult. But it is a good baseline, just understanding of what you've experienced. So ACE stands for adverse childhood experiences. And so the more adverse childhood experiences you've had as a child, statistically, the more likely you are to have more negative health outcomes as an adult. And so it's a thing to just keep in mind and also process to try to prevent these things from manifesting. If you have 4 or more ACEs, so the questionnaire is 10 questions. So if you're answering yes to 4 or more of them, then that increases the likelihood of dealing with anxiety and depression as an adult, having issues with addiction and substance abuse. You're more likely to experience more violence in your adult life, and also more likely to attempt suicide. So this study, while it was done, when it was originally done, the population was about 70% white. It was folks who had access to healthcare. These are folks who are pretty privileged when it comes to where they are. But this study has been done in all types of populations, including the population we're most familiar with, which is folks who are incarcerated and folks who are inside. And what they found in this study that was done pretty recently, 2021, was that individuals who are inside had 4 or more ACEs. So the majority of them had experienced a high amount of trauma in childhood. So just to give a quick trigger warning, we are going to read through the questions that the ACE study asks. Part of the reason we do this is to counter the culture of shame and silence about trauma and really give it a voice. We can often speak really generally about trauma, but actually talking to what that looks like, especially for a child, is a painful reality, and we really do want to shine some light on that. So what we're going to do is read out the questions that are used in that so that folks are aware of what ACEs can look like. You are also welcome to kind of score yourself. So as I'm reading them, if you're saying yes, you can count how many times you're saying yes to see what your ACE score would be. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and read the ACE study questions. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so the first question is, 1, did your parent or other adult in the household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, or act in a way that made you afraid that you might be physically hurt? 2, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you, or ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured? Number 3, did an adult or person at least 5 years older than you ever touch or fondle you or have you touch their body in a sexual way? 4, did you often or very often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special? 5, did you often or very often feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, or had no one to protect you? 6, were your parents ever separated or divorced? 7, was one of your parents often or very often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at them? Were they ever repeatedly hit or threatened with a weapon? 8, did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or alcoholic or who used drugs? 9, was a household member depressed or had a mental health disorder? Or did a household member attempt suicide? And 10, was a household member ever incarcerated? Okay, so those are the questions. You know, when me and Dejan took the quiz, we both found that we were, I think, at an 8. So truly a lot of trauma that has manifested in our adult lives. And so that is a big part of why we do this work, a big part of why it's so important to know where we are and also what our clients are coming to us with. So the takeaway really is that trauma starts early, it has deep impacts on our lives. And if it's not processed or intervened with early and through our systems, then there are some negative health and behavior outcomes, a lot of outcomes that are often criminalized in our society and intersect with what our clients are going through. It's not a perfect study. It's been shifted and changed and made more inclusive over the years, but it is foundational to trauma-informed care and important to understand.
And I just wanted to add in that most of our clients have also scored higher than a 7, 8. So.
Okay, so we're just going to pause. You know, speaking about trauma and being as specific as we were, it can, you know, cause folks to feel ungrounded, even might trigger some things. So please take this time and at this pause to ground yourself in any way that you can, and just let us know with a, I don't know, a thumbs up or something in the chat to let us know you're good and ready to keep going. Awesome.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, let's talk about trauma in the brain now. So trauma can also, let me go ahead and close this. Trauma can also be defined as an injury to brain functioning. Certain parts of the brain can start over functioning while others are under functioning. So I have actually been doing a lot of research myself because this is all very new to me. I knew I had trauma, but I didn't know that there was a difference between my right side of my brain, my left side of my brain, how they both process. And so this is our brain, and our right side of our brain, our right hemisphere, it's where we have our emotional reactions, our survival instincts kick in. It feels like, you know, when we're triggered, it's happening right now, like we're right in that moment again, whatever that trauma was. Where our left side of the brain, it's more logical. We problem solve on that side. We recognize the past, we can process through the past. Maybe we've gotten some coping skills, we're in some therapy. And so, you know, the goal would usually to be, I mean, sorry, not usually, but the goal would be to kind of try and transfer the information from our right side of our brain over to our left. So that way, whenever the triggers do happen and we are placed back in that moment, if our right side is overreacting, because that's where our trauma is stored, we're able to kind of process through that instead of just react to it. Becca, do you have anything to add to this part?
No, that was perfect.
Okay. Okay, so now we're going to talk about triggers. You've been saying this often throughout the whole training that we've had so far. And so anything that sends you back into a trauma response would be a trigger. It could be a smell. It could be someone yelling, someone slamming something really hard. It could be the way someone's tone is with you. There are a lot of different things. It could be, you know, a sound, just the person and their behavior. They remind you of how you were, you know, how it was when your parents were teaching you as a young child, and there's some fear connected to that. So when we are triggered, it's important to ground. And I know that grounding sounds so cliche, like, okay, we're going to ground, how you get a client to ground, but there are really ways to get them to ground, to put them in the moment. And they, you know, to the point to where they don't even know that you're doing that. And we'll give an example of what that looks like a little bit later. Okay, so now we're going to talk about instinctual trauma responses. So the studies show that this is usually all of our responses at some time or another in our lives. We all respond differently to trauma. And so we'll kind of just explain what each of those are. And then that way, the next time that you are triggered or a client is triggered, you're able to really, you know, kind of see what trauma response they're in. The first is startled. So it's a state of high alert, kind of ready to react. Your body, you can feel that your body is aching, it's bracing, kind of, your muscles are tensed, your breathing kind of stops or comes to like, you know, it kind of feels like you're stopped in time and just really focused on whatever's going on there. It could be fight or flight. And this is when you'll start to feel kind of your heart pumping really fast. You're breathing in and out. Maybe your nails, your fingernails are bared. You could even feel like this dryness coming to your mouth. And then there's freeze, where you're just kind of frozen in that time. And maybe your silence is your best, you know, thing to use in that moment, because you're trying to process whatever it is that's going on, and you can't really react to it in the way that someone else would.
Yeah. And then there's a less, I guess, less well-known trauma response, which is altered state of consciousness. So this is the feeling of life being kind of a dream, your loss of body attachment. I know in clients that I've had, and even my own experience with sexual trauma, you can kind of feel like you're looking at yourself from the outside. That's another part of being in an altered state of consciousness. And then there's also autopilot. And I think a lot of us might not even be aware that we're in this trauma response at work and other, you know, daily parts of our routine. And this is really when you're kind of in a robot-like place where you're not really feeling your emotions, but are submitting and going along in an autopilot place. And then there's also self-repair, which is where after you've gone through all the instinctual trauma responses, you kind of naturally end in the self-repair. And that can honestly look like sleeping, eating, crying, even if there was no emotion at first with the trauma. Once you get back to a place where you can feel you're in your body again, that's our natural response to trying to repair what the trauma did to ourselves. So another part of the instinctual trauma response method that we've been trained in, and what has helped us kind of talk to our clients and even talk to ourselves about what we're experiencing, is recognizing that even though we are one person and are one individual, we have very different parts all in us that have been created to survive maybe the traumas that we've experienced. But they're the parts of us that come out when there is a traumatic situation. And so if you've ever said to yourself, a part of me wants to do this, but a part of me wants to do that, then that's a great way to explain what our internal mindscape looks like all the time, and is even more prevalent when you've experienced trauma, because now you have parts of you that are trying to protect you from that trauma happening again. And that part of you could look like a very angry part. It could look like a very anxious, even suicidal part that wants to get out of the situation no matter what. And that can seem like an extreme jump, but to that part, that's how they survived. Like that's how they got through. And so in this, we are hoping that as a trauma-informed advocate, as a person who's working with trauma and working with people who have been traumatized, to be aware of which parts are out while we're doing that work, and also to know that even if you have those parts that are coming out, your true self is your anchor. Your true self has not been impacted by trauma. Your core, who you really are, as woo-woo as it could sound, is love, is compassion, is care. It's probably why you're in this work in the first place. And if we can just keep coming back to that self, all of the parts that are interacting can come back to a place of peace. And so there's actually a good way to map this out for yourself. We're not going to do that today. We do a more interactive version of this training where we are drawing and getting to our core, figuring out who our true self is, like what are those values and descriptives of yourself that cannot be changed, that trauma can't touch. And then what are the other parts that are there and that come out. Maybe, I have a snappy part that, can be kind of bossy at work. That part is also, probably started in trauma, probably is rooted in, being the oldest child and feeling like I had to take over for my siblings. Like, that part of me is still there. And so just bringing that part back to my true self and letting them know it's okay. We can be, we can be calm. So we're going to model and show an example of Dejan's true self map.
Yeah, so this is actually the exact true self versus hurt parts graph that we did during our training. And so this is, and it was really helpful for me to see like a visual of what I was feeling compared to like just going through the motions. I actually have this printed out and it's on my wall at home, right where my desk is. And it's really helpful for me when I am, moving in shame, or I kind of feel stuck in time, or I'm worried a lot, or I'm impulsive, for me to identify like, wait a second, I'm not moving from my true self. My true self, I can process through things. I'm resilient. I'm empowering. I can reach out if I have an issue or a question. There's no need to be overwhelmed. The lack of belief in my ability, well, that goes against the fact that I am super creative and I do a lot of different things that are my voice does matter in the spaces that I'm in, and it's been shown. So it really helps to have this visual somewhere near, and even for a client to have them kind of work it out with you and then take it home and say, anytime you forget who you are, pull this out. Or if you feel like you're, pulling from the wrong part of you, pull this out. So yeah, this exercise was actually really helpful for me.
So yeah, being trauma informed, it's really it's basically a state of mind that we're embodying. We want to be in our true self most of the time and just be aware and accountable when we're not. And so one way to think about it is compassionate detachment. So we're not going to be overly enmeshed and overly involved and take on other people's trauma, but still keep a compassionate, detached place. It's also our true self can be that perfect parent. So when we're interacting with clients and even interacting with ourselves, just continuing to come from a place of non-judgmental ness and unconditional positive regard, just really truly understanding where a person is coming from. We are human, so this is not easy, but it is possible, and it just takes time and practice with these trauma informed values. So best practices. So these are the 5 main values of trauma-informed care. So basically, with a client, with yourself, you want to just establish a space of safety, no matter what that is. So if it's a client meeting, if it's a prep right before a hearing, anytime where you're working with someone who has a trauma background or might be going into a situation that might be traumatic, creating a safe space is really important. And how you do that is really just to listen. Ask your client, ask folks, what do they need to feel safe in this situation? You can ground with them. On our hotline, when we do legal calls, we always give a disclaimer first that establishes confidentiality and that what they're saying is not going to be shared. And so that in itself can create a safe space for a person. We also have guidelines that we'll put up before meetings about, agreeing to disagree, and it's okay to really try on all these different perspectives. These are all ways to really create a container that's safe with your client. You can also use forms of empowerment. And this is really just by trying to level the power dynamic, respect, and really encourage your client's judgment and autonomy. Give them as much, and that goes into choice as well, like really giving your client as much choice as possible, asking open-ended questions instead of, as attorneys, we can kind of be on autopilot and go with what we think works for a case, but really stepping back and asking permission before doing a lot of different steps in a case can, again, create choice and is very trauma informed. And then also collaboration, making it a team effort when you're working with clients and when you're working with anyone, really just emphasizing that this is collaborative and that you're working together for a solution and that their goal is truly what matters. And then ultimately with anything, it's very trauma informed to try to establish some type of trust before moving forward in a relationship. Even again, and this doesn't have to be ongoing clients, it can even be in a situation where you're volunteering or doing discrete tasks. Like I'm thinking like, if we're writing a declaration, I'm gonna need an hour to hear my client's story. And that in itself could bring up some traumas. And so starting by even telling a little bit about myself and opening the space so that, there's empathy and compassion there and folks know what my role is and why I'm asking certain questions and why I'm doing this. This can very much create more trustworthiness and is a trauma-informed way to do that meeting. And then I can't stress enough just how powerful validation is for a client who's experiencing trauma, for anyone who's experiencing trauma. Part of, again, the traumatic piece of things is that you can feel like your situation is not taken seriously or not even believed. And so validating a client when they're experiencing something, even if you haven't experienced it yourself, it does so much in terms of keeping the space trauma informed and safe. And these are just real examples of things that you can say, because I even know that, when I have a client telling me things that, inside I'm like, this is horrific, like, I can't believe you've gone through this, you can freeze and not know what to say. So these are some examples of things that are really great to say, really great validating statements that can support a survivor and support a person who's sharing their trauma with you or even experiencing it in the moment. And so I'll go through some of them. I too would feel this way if I was in your situation. I'm really sorry that you're dealing with this. I appreciate that you feel comfortable to share this with me. I can understand why you felt XYZ. I can understand. That doesn't sound fair. That's not respectful. I know at times like it can feel like we need to be in some kind of neutral position, but it's totally okay to really have your human responses and really show those empathy in your statements. And saying I would probably feel the same way if I was in your position. These are things that validate a person's experience and even their responses in the moment. So now to wrap up, we're gonna do kind of just talk through some examples we've seen in our work and show how the instinctual trauma responses show up and how validating statements and again, any of the trauma-informed values really do work on the ground and we can infuse that into our work daily. So these are all real case studies, real clients that we've worked with and how we dealt with the situation. So for the first example, I had a client who I was representing in a custody and visitation hearing. And this client had tried multiple times to actually get visitation. And so this hearing felt very important in that she had representation for the first time and it really was a big deal. And so while we were in that hearing, we had grounded before, but as the hearing was going, the client's child actually read into the record a statement that was pretty detailed and had explained different traumatic experiences that the child had gone through with the client, and ended with the child saying, they don't want anything to do with their parent. And I could just see as this was going on, my client was more and more offline, getting more and more worked up. They were crying hysterically. And so, in a hearing situation where my client was going to have to talk and testify after this, it became really important to one, recognize that they were in a trauma response. And I would say, at this point, it was freeze. The client was not really able to talk or really put out words. They also were very much in an altered state. You could tell that she wasn't in the present. She was looking, all over and was, talking about past situations. It was just very clear that she wasn't in the hearing where we were and wasn't recognizing what was coming next. And so in order to go through that situation, again, I had to recognize, ooh, this is triggering things for me. So I started doing some deep breaths and grounded myself. And then ultimately started with some validating statements, letting my client know that, yes, like this is very emotional and I totally understand why you're feeling the way you feel. That was a very hard thing to hear. What can I do? What can we do right now to get us through the hearing? And at that moment, she was okay with us doing some breaths. I did ask, the court for a moment, and that in that moment, it was really important to bring her down before we could do anything else. So again, those validating statements and grounding really did help us get to the next step in the hearing. But again, these are things that are happening all the time. And it's so important to have some tools in hand of how to handle that situation.
Yes, thank you, Becca. So the example that I'm gonna give, sometimes it does go this way. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to ground this client, but we were able to get to a common ground and revisit the conversation later. And the reason I wanted to use this example is because sometimes that's what it's going to look like. Our clients are going through many different things, many different emotions. We are not therapists, so we try our best to like recenter them and reground them and bring them to the moment. But if it doesn't work, there's still ways that we can work through that. So the the example that I'm going to give, he had a client who was fighting a case and also going through a CPS case as well. And so she had this paper trail of a lot of like violence and anger, and she got into it with her workers. She got into it with the visitation center. She just continued to get into it with a lot of different individuals, and it was brought up at her hearing for her CPS status review. And so the goal for this meeting was that we were going to meet and we were going to come up with a plan on what it is that we needed to do internally, but also to rebuild the relationship with the CPS worker, for them to see all of the great things that she's doing and her trauma not be the one thing that continues to trigger her to make these bad decisions. And so our client knew exactly what the meeting was for, but because of the trauma that she has experienced all of her life and always having to be that assertive person and some of the things that she went through, she kind of had this mentality towards life that was like, her healing wasn't, she didn't understand what healing meant or that it was even something that she could obtain. And so the way that she reacted and responded was more of, if I'm in control, then that's the way that I'm going to get what I want. And so she was already very frustrated because of what happened at the court hearing. What she heard was she just wasn't getting her son back. What she heard was she wasn't good enough. What she heard was all the things that she's been doing is just not enough. So by the time we sat down, she was already very upset. I basically started off by, just congratulating her on all the work that she had done so far, how proud I was of her, that she hadn't given up, that she had this resilience. And, we're just going to plan for the next 6 months of what this looks like. And so in that plan, obviously there was some anger management, because that was something that the court discussed. It was, and as soon as I said anger management, she blew up. Now, this is a client that I've never had an issue with where, she would get aggressive or anything like that. But now I'm seeing what everybody else has, gotten to see. So I continue to bring her back to the moment. Okay, I understand what you're saying. And I understand you don't think that you need anger management, but this trauma that you've had throughout the years that you've gone through, the way that you are reacting to things, it's not favorable and it's not helping you in the situation. And so I just kind of continue to bring her back to, but however, that's okay. Let us help you put together a plan on what that's going to look like. We're going to pull together resources, anger management, therapy. We're going to walk through you with things. We can advocate for you with your CPS worker and kind of work as that middle person until you're able to communicate with her in a way that would be helpful. And so regardless of what I said or how many times I brought her back to the moment, she started to get aggressive with me. Now, at this time, it's starting to trigger something in me, because in the environment that I grew up in, domestic violence was in the home, so it was normalized. All of the neighbors were going through the same thing. It was normalized. Fights would happen all the time. I've got into many as a youth as well. So she's now getting really aggressive in a way where it's triggering this fight or flight in me. And if I didn't have the training that I had, I would probably think that it had something to do with me, instead of the fact that she's just going through so many different trauma responses at once, and she's not aware of it. So I knew that it had nothing to do with me, but I also knew that my grounding techniques were not working. And so what happened at that point is I just basically stopped the conversation and I said, okay, it looks like you have a plan for what you're going to do next. If you do need an extra set of hands to help you with that plan, you just let me know. But at this moment, it doesn't look like we can come to a common ground on what today's purpose was. So because of that, I'm going to have to end this conversation and we can revisit it at another time. She tried to continue and I just reiterated, we're going to have to end this conversation and we can continue it at another time. And in that moment, that was the best choice for how much of a instinctual trauma response she was having to what was going on, to make sure that she was okay, but at the same time, I was okay. So yeah, that was the thought, the client that came to mind when I wanted to really explain you know, if those things don't work, that's always an option, and to be okay with that option.
Absolutely. Thank you. So, yeah, those are our examples. And again, I'm sure you've had your own experiences through clients and are probably thinking back like, I hope I handled that right. And just know that this is, it's a work in progress. We're all working toward being as trauma informed as we possibly can. And so, yeah, with this knowledge and with this awareness, we're just hoping that we, yeah, are more intentional with how we interact with each other, and have a bit more grace and compassion that we are all carrying things that we're not always aware of, and recognizing that, yeah, that's what being trauma informed is about, is just acknowledging that that is prevalent and here. So that is it for us. Thank you so much for listening, for being engaged, and for really, yeah, being open to this work. We appreciate you so much. We do have a poll or a survey. So for once this is wrapped up, if you um, want to give any feedback about our training, please fill out that survey. We are going to ground out just because, again, we're modeling what it's like to go through all the motions of, you know, any of this work, and come back to ourselves so that we can go the rest of the day and not be, I guess, harmed by, yeah, what we talked about today. So we're going to do a quick grounding where you'll just take a deep breath where you're at. And we'll start with the deep breaths, and then we'll read out these affirmations for you all. So we'll take a deep breath. And we'll breathe out. I always have to do more than one just to get real grounded. So one more. And then we'll say these grounding statements to ourselves. I am at peace. I am centered and grounded. I release all fear and anxiety, and I allow myself to live in the present moment. Awesome. We are open to some questions. We have about 2 minutes. So yeah, that's, any questions are, yeah, please do. And thank you again for being here.
I am going to share the survey in the chat if I can. And if everyone would take a few minutes and do the survey before we go, that would be great. And if you have any questions, please post them in the chat.
So, is there a way to send the poll again?
I think we're good on the poll. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Really appreciate it.
Yeah,
So Rebecca and Dejan, do you ever have an occasion where you just have to end a representation in situations where you just simply cannot meet the individual's needs? So what are your comments on that?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I've had to, like, I've started work with folks who, you know, want to do, for example, there's a remedy in California for human trafficking where you can get your whole criminal record vacated. But it's a very long process in which we have to get, you know, all the police reports. We have to write out the full story. We have to go really in depth and into a person's, you know, most traumatic time of their life when they were being trafficked. And so with that, I've had clients who were just not ready. Like every time we would start the story, you know, it would take hours because we're you know, bringing her back down with the emotions and things of that nature. And so it was a conversation that we had in a safe space where, you know, I let her know, like, you know, it's seeming like it's not your fault, but the parts of this process are bringing up a lot, and it seems like it would be more, effective and useful if we can deal with some of the trauma first and then go through this process. And so that's where we would link them up with the social services and support in that way, where a legal situation is not the best place because of the trauma responses that are coming up. So yes, sometimes ending representation or even recommending social support to deal with the trauma first is the most trauma-informed way to go about it, just because it's not feasible at the time.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question. I was looking at the chat. It looks like they don't have access to the form. Becca? Okay, she's gonna go in and change that. Thank you all. What was the question?
The question, Dejan, was whether or not there has been an occasion where you have to end the representation or end the relationship with the client because you simply cannot overcome the obstacles that are caused by trauma, either in your own personal life or in the life of the client.
Yeah, even with the clients that I have, and I'm not an attorney, but there have been clients where I just don't have the resources, I don't have the training, and I don't want to waste their time, working with them if I know I can't serve them to the best of my ability and it's really going to be helpful. So it's always good to give that warm handoff and just be honest about that. Because we have a couple of clients who their mental health is in a severe state, and unfortunately we don't have what they need, but we always make sure that we connect them to someone who does.
Great, that's good information. And so Becca and Dejan, you talked about triggers, and I was trying to respond to a question here. And how often do you feel that impacts your work as a lawyer or your work in dealing with your respective cases? Do you feel that there's some points where you have to pull away from a case because of a personal trigger? So what are your comments on that?
Absolutely. And I think that's where knowing your own trauma, knowing your own history and background and what is more sensitive and triggering for you is important. There are cases and clients that hit closer to home than others. For me, I've had to pass on, because we do a legal hotline. So even passing on a client who I started to do an intake with, but once I recognize, okay, this is touching on some things around, pedophilia and childhood sexual abuse, which are things I'm still working through, and may not be able to be as as emotionally clear and in my true self all the time, because it triggers different parts of me. So yeah, in those situations, again, knowing your own background, knowing your own trauma is so important, and recognizing, yeah, should this be delegated? Can someone else who doesn't have that same sensitivity work with that client? Yeah, absolutely. Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, I think it's really important to make sure that we're intentional about having spaces that we can process what we're going through, and not feeling like just because we're in this leadership role, or this attorney or this social services manager, I should be able to carry everything, because that's just not the reality. A lot of our clients, especially the newer clients, which is the majority of them, are coming from they're in programs, and a lot of them are getting their kids back. And I was in foster care. My mom dealt with drug use when I was young, and so that really triggered me from when it comes to like the children, and maybe the mom is still battling and she's not really ready, and so that little girl in me is like, girl, get it, wait a second, we got to get this done. We got to fight for these babies, we have to. And it's because I wish that she was in the state at that time to do that. And so, but I've also this part of my heart has also been very softened for these women, and understanding my mom differently now, and understanding like where she was in that moment. And that what helped me with that is making sure that I do have therapy on my own, and I do have spaces that I can process. And I think those are really important, because we are going to continue to be triggered, and that's never going to stop. I think it's just us continuing to focus on how do I process through these triggers in a way where it's healthy for me, but I can still serve clients to the best of my ability. But yeah, I've had those moments as well where I've had to talk to my supervisor, like, hey, this is this one right here, it's a little heavy for me, and I don't know if I can hold this space for them right now. So yeah, and that, I think that in itself is healing.
Okay, I'm checking to see if we have any other questions. Okay, we will just take just a couple more minutes to give everyone an opportunity to complete the poll. And I want to thank Rebecca and Dejan for joining us here today. This was a wonderful presentation, and we are so grateful that you took the time out of your busy schedules to present this very valuable information to us today. So we are really grateful. So we really love to have you back in the future to do this again. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Happiness. Yes.
Okay, if no one has any other questions, if you will just do the survey and we can wrap it up. Thank you.